Virtue doesn't always don the guise of wickedness, yet frequently malevolence, cloaked in the semblance of righteousness, perpetrates its deranged acts. Ought we to have faith in those who surround us? Let's journey back 4 decades to the dawn of 1984, to the quaint borough of Falls, nestled in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. This is where young Terri Brooks, a mere 5 years old, resided. Terri Lynn entered the world on September 13, 1958, born to George and Frances. She was the firstborn among 4 siblings. During Terri's adolescent years, her parents parted ways. It was an arduous period for the entire household, particularly for the youngsters. They had to acclimate to novel transformations in their lives, and the eldest daughter had to assume the role of a guide for her brothers and sisters. Terri was portrayed as an exceptionally joyful, exuberant, and outgoing young lady. She formed friendships effortlessly and possessed the ability to interact with others effectively. Upon completing high school, Terri pursued higher education and concurrently commenced employment as a server to assist her family in some capacity. It was this very occupation that ultimately became Terri's passion. The student resolved that she aspired to further her career in the culinary and dining sector. After serving as a waitress for a period, the young woman was able to showcase her finest attributes and secure a managerial role for herself. Her affability and loquaciousness were ideally suited for customer service, while her diligence and tenacity enabled her to oversee others and coordinate the operations of the entire establishment. A young man named Alfred Scott Keefe was employed as a chef in this eatery, and he and Terri developed a strong affection for one another. A romance quickly blossomed between them, culminating in an engagement. For Terri's loved ones, this was quite an unexpected development, but they concluded that if Terri was content, they would rejoice for her as well. The couple was deeply enamored with each other and envisioned spending the remainder of their lives together. They intended to wed in the summer of 1984. Terri was immensely thrilled about the forthcoming occasion. She eagerly anticipated shopping for bridal gowns and selecting attire for herself and her bridesmaids. Brooks' professional life was also progressing. The young woman secured a new position as a night supervisor at Roy Rogers' restaurant. Employees regarded her as an equitable and upright manager. If they devoted themselves wholeheartedly to their work and adhered to the established rules, there were no issues. But Terri didn't hesitate to deal firmly with indolent and undependable staff members. She could assert her authority. This was the responsibility of a manager. Terri had grown accustomed to working night shifts at the restaurant, and it had become a part of her regular routine. But on the evening of February 4th, 1984, something went awry, because for some inexplicable reason, she never returned home this time. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. Despite the fact that Terri and Scott were engaged, they maintained separate residences. The following morning, as Scott was driving by his fiance's abode, he observed that her vehicle was absent from the driveway adjacent to the house. This struck him as peculiar. So he halted, exited his car, knocked on the door, and inquired with his future father-in-law about Terri's whereabouts. In tandem with George, they inspected the young woman's bedroom and deduced that she had not returned home the previous night. The distressed father seized the phone and contacted the Roy Rogers restaurant to ascertain if she was unharmed. However, the individual on the other end of the line corroborated the gravest apprehensions. Terri had vanished. She had departed from this world eternally. Around 6 a.m., one of the daytime supervisors of the same establishment arrived at work and made an utterly horrifying revelation. Upon entering the restaurant's kitchen, he stumbled upon the lifeless form of Terri Brooks. The young woman was sprawled in a pool of her own blood on the floor, with an enormous meat knife protruding from her neck, and her body was riddled with defensive wounds and contusions. Terri had been viciously assaulted and slain right at her place of employment. As soon as the manager discovered the body, he promptly dialed 911, and when George Brooks phoned the restaurant to inquire about his daughter's whereabouts, a law enforcement officer answered him and conveyed the tragic tidings. An autopsy was performed subsequently. The pathologist ascertained that the official cause of Terri's demise was likely strangulation. She had ceased breathing in a garbage bag placed over her head. Apparently, there was a vicious struggle between the young woman and the assailant, hence all the bruises. She also sustained a stab wound to the neck that only paralyzed her. She could no longer resist. Moreover, Terri was struck on the head multiple times against the concrete floor of the kitchen, which resulted in a cerebral hemorrhage. But even after all these dreadful injuries, the young woman was still alive. Perhaps she was lying unconscious when a plastic garbage bag was pulled over her head and fastened around Terri's head. Terri was still respiring when this occurred, as there was moisture inside the bag. Also at the scene, law enforcement noticed that Brooks's shoes were lying on the kitchen floor not far from where the body was. It was surmised that this is where the attack commenced. The young woman herself was wearing a winter coat. Therefore, everything transpired when she exited the restaurant in the evening to go home, approximately after midnight when the restaurant closed. There were no indications of breaking and entering, suggesting that Terri let the criminals in herself when she was departing through the front door. The police swiftly concluded that the night manager's death was most likely part of a robbery attempt. Approximately $2,500 was stolen from the safe in the office. Brooks's purse lying nearby was also emptied. Items were shaken out directly onto the floor, and the money was taken. Perhaps Terri knew the attacker, or saw his face. Consequently, she was killed so that she would not alert the authorities and would be unable to identify the perpetrator. There was a spare exit in the restaurant that was closed for the night, but in the morning the manager and the police discovered that the window on the doors was shattered from the inside. Most likely, this is how the offender vacated the premises. Following the police, forensic experts arrived at the scene. They scrutinized the kitchen and restaurant hall for fingerprints and collected skin and hair samples from the body of the deceased, particularly from under her nails, to search for the perpetrator's DNA. However, all these events transpired in the mid-'80s, when comparative DNA analysis and forensic technologies were still in their nascent stages. Such evidence was not genuinely suitable for establishing the identity of the assailant. Nevertheless, the investigation into Terri Brooks's death commenced. The police interrogated and examined individuals connected to the deceased. Naturally, one of the first people they focused on was her fiance, Scott Keefe. When questioned about his whereabouts the previous night, the man responded that he was sleeping at home. Typically, Scott would meet his fiancée after her shift so that she wouldn't have to collect the revenue and close the restaurant building alone. But on that fateful evening, he had unfortunately retired early because he had an early shift the next morning. The guy felt remorseful about this. After all, if he had met Terri, she would be alive. This was the sole occasion he wasn't there, and his future wife desperately needed protection. In addition to conversing with Scott, the police also spoke with other close ones, who all unanimously stated that Terri did not and could not have enemies, as she was a kind and amiable person. But when investigators delved deeper into Terri's work activities and questioned her colleagues from the restaurant, new figures emerged in the case. Terri's subordinates mentioned one conflict in the workplace and named a guy who had a strong aversion to the girl. His name was Steve Daly. Steve formerly worked at the Roy Rogers restaurant as a chef, but due to his quick temper, the young man often lost his composure and caused a great deal of trouble for his colleagues. He obstinately refused to accept Terri as his boss and rejected all the rules she established. Because of him, the atmosphere in the team was unpleasant, which often affected the service of restaurant patrons. Terri was not going to disregard his attacks. Because Steve was creating problems in the workplace, the manager often confronted him about his behavior, but this only led to numerous arguments. During one of them, Daly even referred to Terri as a bitch. Therefore, ultimately he was terminated just a couple of weeks before the girl was brutally attacked. However, after that, Steve still visited the restaurant, ordered food, and tried in every possible way to anger Terri, and even intimidate her. After conversing with the restaurant employees, the police had a serious contender for the role of the criminal. Most importantly, he had a compelling motive. Because of Terri, the guy lost his job. Maybe it was an act of revenge. Steve was summoned for questioning at the police station. He did not conceal the fact that he was genuinely furious with Terri. He absolutely disliked her. If she hadn't been a woman, he would have hit her once. However, the guy denied that he had dealt with his former boss. On the night of the incident, Daly tried to gain entry to a nightclub, but he was denied access. The police could not verify his story as they did not find any witnesses. It turned out that Steve did not have a sufficiently convincing alibi to be excluded from the list of suspects. Investigators asked the young man to take a polygraph test. He easily passed the lie detector test, which indicated to the police that he was being truthful. The police temporarily backed off from the guy, but in any case, they kept an eye on him. The police continued to check other employees of the Roy Rogers restaurant who were of interest to the investigation. In particular, they were interested in people who worked the same shift with Terri, and another suspect emerged. His fingerprint matched one of those found on the garbage bag placed over Terri's head, as well as on the window of the back door, from where the criminal allegedly fled. However, the employee had a logical explanation for why his prints were at the place where he worked. His responsibilities included collecting all the garbage in the evening, taking it out, and inserting a new bag into the bucket. So it's not surprising that his fingers left prints there. Unfortunately, there was no other evidence of this person's involvement in the attack. Moreover, the employees had a plausible alibi for that evening. All individuals somehow close to Terri were thoroughly checked and excluded from the list of suspects. Now, the police had a theory of an attack by a stranger with the aim of stealing funds from the establishment's cash register. Robberies of restaurants at that time were quite frequent in the surrounding areas. Of course, it did not come to the point of killing employees, but there were exceptions. About 2 weeks after Terri's death, another very similar attack occurred in another Roy Rogers restaurant. The assistant manager was leaving the establishment's restroom when someone assaulted him from behind, hit him on the head, and fled the scene. Nothing was stolen, and the police wondered if these two cases were connected. Fortunately, the assistant manager survived the attack, but the perpetrator was never found. A few days after that, there was another attack on a food service worker. This case occurred at an establishment in the city of Scranton, about 130 miles from Roy Rogers. In February 1984, a young woman named Kathy Hunchak was preparing to close the cafe in the evening. She had no idea that outside in the dark stood a man observing her actions. He was waiting for all the other employees to go home and for Kathy to be alone. This man intended to steal money from the cash registers. He did not take into account that all the revenue had already been put in the safe, and the girl did not have access to it. Instead of just leaving, the man took the cash from Kathy's wallet, and after that, he took the girl's life by stabbing her several times. Since the attack on Kathy occurred literally a couple of weeks after the death of Terri Brooks, detectives suspected that these cases could be related to each other, because there were numerous similarities between them. Soon, the Scranton police made an arrest in the Kathy Hunchak case. The assailant turned out to be another cafe employee who decided to profit from his own workplace. As a result of further proceedings, this individual received a death sentence. After his arrest, he was interrogated by detectives leading the Terri Brooks case, but the man refused to talk to them at all and answer any questions. They still managed to obtain his fingerprints and compare them with those found at the crime scene, but none of the prints matched. The investigation reached an impasse. The police studied countless potential suspects, tracked down various leads, trying to link Terri's case to other incidents, but they simply suffered failure after failure. The detectives were never able to identify the person who committed this heinous crime. In the coming months, the case of the brutal attack on the night manager of the restaurant was placed on the shelf with unsolved cases. Gradually, it began to be forgotten due to the influx of new incidents that needed to be investigated. Terri Brooks died in her prime, and her killer was calmly walking free. For almost a decade and a half, there were no developments in Terri's case. Her grieving family was left without answers and without justice, which simply shattered their hearts. The year 1998 arrived, and a small glimmer of hope appeared in Terri's case. The Falls Police Department decided to retrieve their old unsolved cases from the archive and recheck some data using advancements in DNA and forensic technologies that had emerged over the years. One of these cases turned out to be the attack on Terri Brooks in 1984. All the evidence in this case was seized from storage and sent for forensic examination. This included the kitchen knife that was found protruding from the girl's neck and DNA samples taken from her body shortly after the discovery. Meanwhile, while all this evidence was being reanalyzed in the lab, new detectives who were assigned to the case began to recheck all the individuals who were in Terri's circle of communication. Her family, friends, colleagues, all underwent repeated interrogations in the hope that they would remember something important that they did not report in the mid-80s. This was done in case someone she knew actually attacked her. The injuries inflicted on the girl indicated this. According to the police, they were too personal in nature and were incredibly vicious. The attacker was clearly enraged with Terri. They also suggested that the person who took the girl's life that night had a much stronger motive than just stealing cash from the safe, and there was indeed a breakthrough in the case. When the new detectives spoke with Terri's former supervisor, they presented him with photos from the crime scene. He had not seen them before, as he was not shown the pictures during the initial investigation, and now he noticed several details that shattered the previous theory into pieces. It was a photograph from Terri's office. At the end of the work shift, the girl would arrange items on the table in a strictly established order. She would empty the ashtray and put all the stationery in the desk drawer. She was a very neat and organized individual. However, in the picture of the office taken that night, everything was different. The stationery was lying on the table, the ashtray was full, and the phone was not in its usual place. This information immediately caught the attention of the detectives. Previously, it was believed that the criminal attacked Terri when she was leaving the restaurant, but according to the testimony of the former supervisor, it turned out to be the opposite. She had not yet left the premises when she was attacked, since she had not completed her usual tasks. The disarray on the desk indicated that she indeed knew the attacker and let him into the restaurant that night. Consequently, this person was close enough to Terri that she was not afraid to stay with him alone in the building at night. That is why the police continued to investigate the close individuals in Terri's life. As part of this investigation, the detectives decided to speak with the girl's old friends, with whom the police for some reason did not talk during the first investigation in 1984. After these conversations, a new suspect suddenly emerged in the case, someone who had actually been in plain sight all these years. It turned out that shortly before her death, Terri confided in a friend that her relationship with her fiance, Scott Keefe, was on the verge of breaking up. She was no longer certain if she truly wanted to marry him. Terri and Scott were not well acquainted when they announced their engagement. Initially, the girl was on cloud nine with happiness and could not wait for the wedding. But this happiness was short-lived because soon cracks began to appear in the relationship. Terri was quite ambitious and made every effort to climb the career ladder in the field of restaurant management. She was doing well at it. In contrast, Scott was the complete opposite. He was dissatisfied with his job as a chef in another restaurant, but he lacked the enthusiasm and motivation like Terri to pursue his dreams, and this made the guy very angry. In addition to everything, Scott was possessive and liked to control his fiancée. He needed to know where she was going, what she was doing, and who she was meeting with. That is why he would meet Terri every time after her night shift at the Roy Rogers restaurant. It was not at all for the girl's safety. The man was checking to see if there was anyone next to her. Obviously, she reached the point where she was tired of Scott's unfounded jealousy, his controlling and abusive behavior. She confessed to her friend that she was unsure if she wanted to go through with the wedding and be with Scott. This was completely new information for the police. In the old case files from 1984, there was nothing that would indicate these problems in their relationship because not everyone knew about it. The detectives leading the Brooks case thought of Scott as a loving and caring fiancé who adored Terri. Her family also really liked Keefe. At least that was the impression the police got. So neither the family of the deceased nor the police suspected the young man of anything. But now that new details of the case had come to light, Scott Keefe was first on the list. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this video. It's really important. All this time, Keefe had been right in front of their eyes. Perhaps Terri told her fiancé about her doubts regarding the upcoming wedding, and he decided that if he couldn't have the girl himself, then she wouldn't belong to anyone. The problem was that the police currently had no solid evidence against Keefe to make an arrest. Fortunately, the answer came from the DNA samples taken from under Terri's fingernails when she was trying to protect her life. The DNA belonged to an unknown man who, according to the police, committed the brutal attack. The same unknown DNA profile was found on the knife sticking out of the girl's neck when she was discovered. Experts had to literally take the weapon apart. They removed the blade from the wooden handle and found particles belonging to the criminal underneath it. Now the police only had to compare the DNA of all the suspects with the obtained sample. And of course, the very first person they wanted to check was Scott Keefe. But if they asked him to provide a sample, the man could panic and go on the run. They didn't have enough evidence to arrest him, so they decided to obtain the DNA without his knowledge. At that time, Scott was still living with his parents. He had managed to get married, have a child, and get divorced again, returning to the family home. Scott was a heavy smoker. The detectives only had to find a cigarette butt, compare the DNA from the saliva, and identify a match. The police set up surveillance on Scott's house, and as soon as one of the owners took out the trash, they grabbed the bag and took it to the lab. Inside were cigarette butts that matched the DNA of the perpetrator. Now the police had solid evidence linking Scott Keefe to the brutal death of his fiancée. The man was taken to the police station for questioning but was not informed of the evidence found. His story about the events of that night was no different from the story of 1984. Therefore, he was offered to take a polygraph test, which he eventually failed. Only after that, a DNA sample was officially taken from him for analysis, confirming the detective's version of Scott's involvement in the death of his fiancée. Even before waiting for the test results, Keefe panicked and began to say strange things. Supposedly, he did not want it to happen and that she attacked him first. Apparently, his nerves were on edge. For 14 years, he lived in fear that the truth would one day come out. And now, when he realized that he was caught, his brain began to produce defensive phrases. When Scott realized that he had compromised himself, he tried to twist his words, but further police questioning forced him to confess to what he had done. When the man realized that his time was up and the police had evidence against him, he admitted what happened on that tragic night. On February 4th, 1984, after midnight, Scott went to the Roy Rogers restaurant where Terri was finishing her evening shift. Other employees of the establishment had already gone home, so no one saw him. The girl let her fiancé in while she was counting the revenue herself. Inside the restaurant, an argument erupted between them because Terri told Scott that she had canceled the wedding and no longer wanted to be with him. She did not like his possessive and domineering character, as well as his constant jealousy. This angered the guy so much that he hit the girl right in the face, after which rage completely consumed him. Terri tried to push him away and drive him out. A fierce struggle ensued between them in the kitchen. Keefe managed to knock his fiancée to the floor. He grabbed her by the shoulders and began hitting her head against the concrete floor, then wrapped his arms around her neck and squeezed with all his might. It is impossible to imagine what Terri felt at that moment when her once beloved person turned into an evil monster in a second, and as if in a test of strength, one of the knives fell from a chair next to them. The girl reached out, but Scott was faster. He grabbed the cold weapon and plunged it into his fiancé's neck. However, even after all these injuries, Terri was alive. The blow to the neck paralyzed her, completely depriving her of the ability to defend herself. Keefe realized that there was no turning back, so he pulled out an empty bag from the trash can in the kitchen and wrapped it around Terri's head. Then he tried to cover his tracks, deciding to stage a banal robbery. He took $2,500 from the office and got out of the restaurant through the back door window, and in the morning, he pretended to be a worried fiance and managed to escape justice. But all these years, he could not forget Terri's eyes begging him for mercy. In February 1999, Scott Keefe was arrested on suspicion of killing Terri Brooks. This happened on the 15th anniversary of her death. He fully admitted his guilt, and in 2000 was sentenced to life imprisonment. After a decade and a half, Terri's family received the answers and closure that they had been waiting for so long. But it was a shock for them to learn that it was Scott, who was always considered a good and sincere guy, who took the life of their Terri. This is the end of the story. Like the video and leave your thoughts in the comments. This was Jeremy. See you soon.